History is a graveyard of bad ideas, but some ideas don't stay buried. They wait for the right temperature of fear to crawl back out. Welcome to Salem, 1692. A place where God is a heavy shadow, and the devil is a neighbor you don't like. Within 12 months, 20 people would be executed, not by a monster, but by a community that believed they were saving the world. It started with a twitch, a bark, a body contorted into shapes that human bone shouldn't allow. But here is the first unexpected truth. The girls weren't the cause. They were merely the ignition. The fuel had been stacking for decades. This wasn't a supernatural event. It was a psychological collapse, a convergent hysteria born from the death of the individual. Today, we perform a necropsy on Salem. We aren't looking for witches. We're looking for us. I am your host. This is Psyche of Power. Let's descend. Act 1. The Architecture of Fear. To understand Salem, you have to understand the frontier mentality. Imagine living in a box. To the east, a cold, indifferent ocean. To the west, a wilderness you believe is the literal kingdom of Satan. Every crop failure was a divine punishment. Every sick child was a cosmic indictment. This is what psychologists call hyper-vigilance. The Puritans suppressed everything. Anger, lust, greed, all driven into the unconscious. What Carl Jung called the shadow. When you don't acknowledge your shadow, you project it onto others. You don't say, I hate my neighbor. You say, my neighbor is a witch. Enter Betty Paris and Abigail Williams. Boredom is a dangerous thing in a society that bans play. They played with magic because it was the only power they had, but power, in the hands of the powerless, usually turns toxic. When the girls started fitting, the village doctor, William Griggs, made a fatal diagnosis. The evil hand is upon them. The first 3 accused were the easy targets. A beggar, a sickly old woman, and a slave, the social outcasts. Here is the first cognitive reversal. The court accepted spectral evidence. If I dream you bit me, you are guilty. This is emotional contagion. In a high-stress environment, humans mirror the biological states of those around them to ensure survival. If the girl screams, the village screams. It's not a choice. It's a neurological hijack. Logic left Salem the moment fear became a survival metric. But why did it spread to the good people? Reversal number 1. This wasn't about God. It was about real estate. Look at the maps. The accusers lived in the poor, rural Salem village. The accused, they lived in the wealthy, coastal Salem town. We see a pattern of economic envy masked as spiritual purity. If I accuse you of witchcraft, your land is seized. Who gets it? Often, the families of the accusers. This brings us to our first deep dive. René Girard's theory of mimetic desire. Girard argued that humans don't know what to want, so we copy the desires of others. This leads to mimetic rivalry. When a community is about to tear itself apart from internal rivalry, it finds a scapegoat. By killing the scapegoat, the community feels a sudden, ecstatic sense of unity. The witch died so the village could live. The tragedy of Salem is that the madness was actually a very efficient social cleaning mechanism. We move to the second act. The trials weren't just a mistake. They were a performance. The girls became celebrities for the first time in their lives. The most powerful men in the colony were hanging on their every word. This is the Lucifer effect, but with a twist. It wasn't just the guards. It was the victims who discovered the intoxicating high of absolute power. The accusations shifted. They stopped targeting the outcasts and started targeting the elite. When Rebecca Nurse, the most virtuous woman in town, was accused, the logic broke. If she could be a witch, anyone could. This is the social proof trap. If everyone says she's a witch, my own eyes must be lying to me. Under extreme stress, the prefrontal cortex, the logic center, shuts down. The amygdala takes over. In Salem, they were living in a state of permanent cortisol flooding. They weren't crazy. They were biologically incapable of nuance. Stoughton never apologized, not even years later. Why? Because of cognitive dissonance. To admit he was wrong would be to admit he was a mass murderer. The brain would rather protect the ego than accept the truth. This leads to reversal number 2. The trials didn't stop because people realized they were wrong. They stopped because the girls got too greedy. They accused the wife of Governor Phipps. They accused the highest-ranking ministers. The machine only stopped when it began to consume the people who built it. When everyone is a witch, no one is a witch. The currency of the accusation was devalued by its own inflation. Let's look at a deep psychological theory, rarely discussed terror management theory, TMT. TMT suggests that humans create cultural bulwarks to manage the paralyzing fear of death. Salem's bulwark was their covenant with God. The witches represented the literal breaking of that wall. The trials were a desperate, violent attempt to repair their cultural identity. They weren't killing people. They were trying to kill their own mortality. Act 3. The cost of a lie. If you want to see the peak of human defiance, look at Giles Corey. He refused to plead guilty or not guilty. If he didn't plead, the state couldn't seize his farm from his sons. They laid stones on his chest to crush a confession out of him. His only words, more weight. Corey used the only thing he had left, his physical existence, to sabotage the psychological machinery of the court. Bridget Bishop, George Burroughs, Martha Corey. Names turned into ghosts. Reversal number 3. The justice system incentivized lying. If you confessed, you lived. If you told the truth, that you were innocent, you died. Salem created a world where the only way to be holy was to be a hypocrite. You might think, we are more evolved now. You are wrong. The technology has changed. The neurobiology has not. Cancel culture is often just Salem with a better interface. The same mimetic contagion. The same scapegoating. We still feel that ecstatic rush of joining the mob. It's the dopamine of the in-group. When you join an online pile-on, you aren't seeking justice. You are managing your own terror. You are proving you belong to the tribe, so the tribe won't turn on you. This is the banality of evil, as Hannah Arendt put it. Most of the people in Salem weren't sadists. They were just people doing their jobs, clerks filing papers, neighbors giving testimony, good people, providing the logistics for a massacre. What is the Psyche of Power takeaway? Power isn't just held by the judge. It's held by the silent majority who agree to the lie. in 1706, and René Girard, one of the primary accusers, stood up in church and apologized. She said she was deluded by Satan. But Satan is just a 17th century word for the collective unconscious. She was the only one of the afflicted girls to ever express remorse. The rest simply disappeared into the folds of history. Today, Salem is a tourist trap. We sell hats and plastic wands where people were strangled by the law. We commodify the tragedy to distance ourselves from it. We treat it as a freak accident of history. But the unexpected truth is that Salem is not a past event. It is a biological potential. Your brain is wired for Salem. It is wired to prioritize tribal belonging over objective truth. To resist the hive mind requires more than intelligence. It requires a specific kind of psychological courage. The courage to be the scapegoat rather than the accuser. History doesn't repeat, but it certainly rhymes. And the rhythm is set by the beating of a fearful heart. We study the psyche not to control others, but to prevent ourselves from being controlled by the ghosts of the collective. Salem was a fever dream that broke, but the virus is still in the blood. Keep your eyes open. The next witch they ask you to burn might be the only one telling the truth. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the darker corners of our nature, subscribe to Psyche of Power. Knowledge is the only antidote to the mob. See you in the next dissection.